Dear participants, I have 10 minutes to give an overview of what we have heard from the different cases, to learn lessons from what has happened in the countries, and at the end to propose some recommendations for policymakers. I prepare this synthesis with Gideon Onuma from the NRI. So this overview comes from a rapid online survey that targeted the researchers involved in the VCA4D projects. Thanks to all, but especially to our colleagues in the partner countries that provided very useful insights from the field and gave consistency to the analysis. However, these insights are not hard facts, and further research would be needed to quantify the emerging impacts. I will first take up key messages from the presentations we just listened to, and then give some general interpretation of what we observed. So among the four export value chain, the pineapple value chain in Togo seems to be the most affected by the COVID crisis. According to Ose and Konga, two subchains, main contributors to economic growth, have been hardly disrupted. Fresh organic pineapple exported by air freight and processed pineapple for local market. Apparently, the state did not take measures specifically for this value chain. Exporters had to quickly adapt the better they can to find a new market. On the other hand, the cocoa value chain in Ecuador resisted rather well and even gained market shares for two main reasons. First, it was already a robust value chain with a quality product differentiation, long-term investment, modern sales methods. Second, farmers' organization responded in different ways, showing the power of collective action, as Joanne explained. Last but not least, the government facilitated access to credit during the pandemic. In an intermediate situation, the cotton value chain in Ethiopia behaved differently depending on the markets. The traditional sector targeting domestic market was lowly disrupted, while the export subchain was highly affected by the fall of international prices. The lesson, according to Jan, is to put more emphasis on domestic markets and to invest on a sustainable standard and quality product, as these markets are less vulnerable, according to Jan, but I saw that some people didn't agree in the chat with this idea. It is difficult for me to conclude on the case of the coffee value chain in Angola, showed by Bernardo and Margarita, because the country is in a very unstable macroeconomic situation with devaluation, inflation, oil crisis, which already has a great impact on the value chain, and it is difficult to isolate the effect of COVID. If we now consider, next slide, the three animal value chain, we have also very disparate effects. According to Adama, COVID-related disruption are heavy for the fisheries value chain in the Gambia, where access to the product is pretty difficult for a large part of the rural population, exposing consumers to food insecurity. Demand and prices have fallen, weakening the small-scale fishers who were already highly vulnerable. The measures taken by the government were not efficient enough, and the producers' organization were not able to reorganize the marketing of fish. In contrast, disturbances have been low in the fisheries value chain in Mali, according to Yvonne and Henri, yet the risks were huge. Shortages in Asian fish imports, which represent about 30% of the country's supply, could have led to food insecurity and to over-exploitation of local fish stock, already fully exploited before COVID, as shown by the VCA4D study. Opposite to the case of the Gambia, the effects were felt more in Bamako than in rural areas. Finally, the dairy value chain in Colombia has overcome the milk collection difficulties. However, there has been a decline in the consumption of high-value processed products, as in the case of Togo for pineapple and Ghana for sorghum. The contraction in processing had led to a decrease in the contribution of this value chain to the GDP. Gustavo and Gabriel showed that the disruption has been limited due to many measures set up by the government. However, the market asymmetries between actors have been reinforced. Regarding the three domestic staple food value chain, the Ghana case study shows the resilience of the small farmers engaged in the domestic market for food or traditional brewery, and the difficulties of the small farmers dependent on the industrial brewery, which offtake fell by about 40%. However, this was a very promising subchain for small farmers, according to the VCA4D study, the last one, the third one. The problems encountered are quite similar for maize value chain in Zambia as Ghana sorghum. Production remains stable this year, but there is a risk for a sharp decline in the next season due to the difficult access to inputs, reduction of extension services, liquidity problems for the trade actors, fall in demand of millers and breweries, and limited capacity of grain absorption. In Nigeria, disruption appears more important than in Zambia, with the maize price hike and labor shortages, food and nutrition security problem, in spite of relief supplies and soft loans targeting small farmers and SME. Next slide. These three sets of examples from the panel show that there are many possible interpretations to understand what happened with the value chains, according to the nature of the product and markets, to the spatial aspect inside the country, to the level of performance of the value chain before COVID, to the capacities of actors to react individually, collectively, or at the government level. Next slide. Yeah, the economic disruptions and the actors affected by the crisis may have been quite different according to the value chains. There are losers and even winners, and not always the same. For example, exporters in export value chain may have faced problems in assessing air freight for perishables, aggregating stock from remote locations, and getting labor for processing, or they may have used the alternative shipping routes and be able to sell into local and regional markets for shelf-stable products. Other example, domestic consumers may have suffered from rising prices or have benefited from an increase in local sales of a product that could not be exported. The economic impact of the COVID were not only negative. Several experts reported innovation in marketing methods, such as a digital platform or the creation of businesses and new market for health protection products, as masks, sanitizers. Next slide. According to the VCA4D experts, social effects may have been outstanding in terms of job losses, struggling conditions for farmers, declining incomes with welfare implication, market inequalities, food and nutrition insecurity in both export and domestic value chain. Next slide. As for the environment, impacts appear more speculative than for the economic and social ones. In most cases, it is suspected that there are no significant adverse environmental impacts, but unintended positive effects. Next slide. I will not go into details with this chart because I need time. But here is an early thinking on cause and effect relationships that allow to understand the impact pathways for value chain. And we started to do it for some examples. Next slide. A widespread feeling among experts is that underlying factors and vulnerabilities in all the value chains are structural. They exist prior to COVID, but became more evident with the pandemic or contributed to worsening the situation for actors. On the contrary, it seems that the sustainable and inclusive value chain resisted better to the pandemic. Next slide. Many initiatives, as you listen, were implemented to address effects of the COVID, be them from the public or private sector, or as a result of collective solutions. The main examples were setting producers' prices, arrangement to ease shipment, release of strategic food reserves, launching input credit schemes, and other ones. According to the expert, solutions implemented, especially by governments, often focused on the urban and not rural population, who are predominantly the producers and workers in agricultural value chain, sometimes had an inadequate scope, focused on temporary symptoms, but not on the structural issues, even linked with the crisis, which require long-term actions. Next slide. By way of conclusions, here are general recommendations to overcome the current situation. This is not, of course, an exhaustive inventory, and many interesting propositions are coming in the chat. Diversification in production by small farmers has to be encouraged. Hence, government support programs which focus exclusively on export crops and on major grain staples need to be discussed. Similar diversification of markets for export community need to be pursued and supported. Bailouts in the form of input credit schemes should be reviewed. Strong and independent farmers organizations need to be promoted. Governments and the private sector must develop together programs to address the long-term structural constraint and vulnerability. Also, they must sustain COVID awareness campaigns, stressing the possibility of future outbreaks. Really, there is an opportunity is there to push for political will to solve evident structural problems in these value chains. So thanks for your listening. I leave the floor now to Eva Yildirim, research officer at VCA4D, that will open the first question and answer session. I forgot to introduce me at the beginning of my presentation. I am Marie-Hélène Dabat, working for AgriNatura and CIRAD Research, scientific director of VCA4D project. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Marie-Hélène, for this very interesting presentation that gives an overview on a diversity of cases. We are now going to proceed with questions and answers. We have received a lot of questions. Thank you very much. All your questions were very interesting, but unfortunately, we had to make a selection due to time limitation. I'd like to remind the speakers that they are expected to give very short answers. The first question comes from Helena and Angel, and it concerns Gambia, Ghana, and Nigeria value chains. Several presentations highlight the importance of local national markets To what extent are local markets really a viable solution in the short, medium term? From this aspect, what can you say regarding fish meal plants in the Gambia? Have they been buying the excess unsold fish from landing sites? I give first the floor to Gideon.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I think the quick answer is that it depends on which type of commodity you are looking at for. Some of the major traditional exports like coffee, cocoa, the domestic market is pretty small. But for others, it's quite sizable. If you take, for instance, the case of pineapple, it's virtually a balance between the two. About 40% could be domestic. Now, the issue is that while many people focus on the export, what has emerged, including from some of the evidence coming from the experts, is that where you integrate the domestic market very effectively into that export-oriented market, you have a greater capacity to cope with the challenges that emerge when such crises arise. Because if you cannot export, you have a local outlet. And even though you are right in saying that these have been mentioned without any quantitative data on relative sizes, and because it was a rapid appraisal assessment that was made, and we need to work to generate more quantitative data to back these assumptions.
Basically, I completely agree with what has been the submission made by Dr. Onuma. In addition to that, it's also important to note that the demand in Nigeria is actually expanding because of the increase in demand for poultry products. And in fact, the federal government recently released about 30,000 metric tons of maize from the National Reserve to complement demand, to actually take care of the supply deficit in the country. And so it's a balance between the export and how to integrate the export market with the local market. So, and because of the seasonality in the supply and the demand for the maize products. So I would completely agree with the fact that the local market is existing and is viable and is growing. But at the same time, it does not mean that there's no market for the export product or for exporting it in the neighboring countries in West Africa. So that's my submission, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Bello. Dr. Mbaye, would you have any comments?
Okay, yes, yes. For the question for Awadi, in general, all fishing companies with large storage and processing capacity have benefited more from the COVID, especially the fish mills. Because the United States was target pelagic as monger. The more united abundance, and their landing are intensive by the fish mills, and the fish mills are very high capacity of storage and processing. Benefited of the situation of surabundance. Thank you.
Thanks, Adama.